In the shadowed history of the Battle of Little Bighorn lies a story not of reckless charge, but of layered decisions, tactical missteps, and the brutal clash between ambition and a resolute defense. Here, George Armstrong Custer's final hours unravel not as a simple military failure, but as a profound study in strategy against the unyielding force of a determined enemy and unforgiving terrain. By dissecting each calculated decision, the shifting dynamics of the battlefield, and the very landscape that turned against him, we uncover a fresh perspective on a battle often mired in myth. As Custer's story unfolds across 4 parts, it reveals the complexities of his choices, the unforeseen strength of his opponents, and the role of the land itself in sealing his fate. Prepare to see Little Bighorn through a new lens, one that challenges assumptions and invites curiosity about the untold layers of this tragic encounter. In the final hour of his life, George Armstrong Custer made choices that would come to define not only his legacy, but the tragic conclusion of the Battle of Little Bighorn. These last decisions, made in the unforgiving landscape of the American West, have since been enveloped in a cloud of myth and speculation. This was not an ordinary conflict, but a battle marked by complex dynamics between the ambitions of a single leader and the resolve of a people defending their culture and way of life. Over the years, historians have attempted to reconstruct these moments, assembling fragments of evidence in an effort to understand the motivations, decisions, and actions that would seal Custer's fate and that of his men. As Custer gazed across the arid terrain, he faced a situation charged with intensity and uncertainty. It was June 25, 1876, at precisely 10:05 p.m., when Custer took stock of the circumstances surrounding him. His sense of purpose was clear. This moment, he believed, would either affirm his reputation as a daring leader or unravel it altogether. With each step deeper into the wilderness, the 7th Cavalry crossed the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn valleys, moving closer to the unknown, and to an enemy they could barely see but knew was formidable. The stakes could not have been higher for Custer and his regiment. Tasked by the U.S. government with subduing a large assembly of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, they were entering a confrontation against a coalition that had openly defied federal orders to remain on reservations. Unbeknownst to Custer at the time, his decisions would consign him to the obscured corridors of history, where truth and myth would intertwine, and his final hours would remain subject to endless interpretation and speculation. Yet, at that critical juncture, he surveyed the rugged landscape and made a defining choice. He would divide his unit into 4 distinct battalions, each with a specific role in his overall plan. This decision has sparked much debate. Some view it as a grievous tactical error, a strategic misstep that fractured his forces when unity may have been crucial for survival. However, Custer's decision was not without reasoning. Reports from his scouts indicated a substantial settlement along the Little Bighorn River, larger than he had anticipated. Realizing that the advantage of surprise was slipping away, Custer believed his strengths lay in rapid, aggressive action that could destabilize the enemy through speed and tactical audacity. Custer's strategy, though straightforward, required precision. To draw the enemy's attention, he directed Major Reno to take 3 companies in a frontal assault on the settlement from the south. Captain Benteen was to lead a separate battalion westward along the ridges, ensuring that no Indian fighters could escape in that direction. Custer himself, leading from the front as always, planned to advance to the north with 5 companies, positioning them along higher ground to flank the settlement and intercept any retreat to the north. Additionally, Custer assigned Captain McDougall to a final battalion responsible for safeguarding the train of supplies, effectively acting as a backup force. The decision to separate the forces reflected not only a tactical consideration, but also a psychological one. Custer was known for his daring strategies and his ability to exploit the unexpected. The choice to divide his forces was consistent with his previous engagements, where he often outmaneuvered and outthought his opponents by taking calculated risks. However, this battle presented an unprecedented challenge. Before him was a vast village populated by thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, numbers that exceeded anything he had faced before. Nevertheless, Custer was convinced that a quick, decisive assault could throw the settlement into disarray. giving his forces the upper hand. As orders were issued, the battalions mobilized with haste, moving into their respective positions. Positioned on the left, Reno's brigade advanced rapidly down the valley. Custer's column ran parallel to Reno's, but as they navigated the rugged terrain, their paths began to diverge. The physical separation of Custer, Reno, and Benteen marked a significant point in the unfolding battle, highlighting a departure from earlier accounts where coordination was presumed to be feasible. This geographical separation, though brief, symbolized a shift where each unit would now operate independently, responding to the increasingly chaotic conditions of the battlefield. From this moment forward, each battalion's actions would be dictated by the unfolding scene around them. Reno, unaware of the overwhelming forces awaiting him, pressed forward. Custer, meanwhile, continued his approach from the north, focusing on intercepting any attempts by the settlement's inhabitants to escape. Custer's boldness in this decision has often been noted in historical records, yet the complexities behind it are less frequently highlighted. Custer was not merely gambling with the lives of his men. He was calculating the possible advantages and risks in real time, acting against an adversary whose true strength remained only partially known. As Custer's battalions moved farther down the valley, the potential ramifications of his decision became increasingly evident. The separation introduced significant challenges in coordination, and the rugged landscape only compounded these difficulties. Despite the obstacles, Custer remained resolute, drawing on his past experiences where dividing his forces had often led to success. However, this situation differed starkly from his previous battles. As the miles between his units grew, so did the complexity of synchronizing their actions. The elements of Custer's strategy, Benteen's reconnaissance mission, Custer's flanking maneuver, and Reno's frontal assault formed parts of a larger tactical framework reliant on speed, timing, and surprise. Yet, as minutes passed, it became clearer that coordinating these efforts across challenging terrain would be nearly impossible. The evolving battlefield introduced new variables that disrupted Custer's original plans. As the battalions advanced, the unpredictability of the situation began to weigh on the outcome of the mission. Reno's attack was the first to encounter significant resistance as he pressed forward under the assumption that the enemy would be scattered and caught off guard. The strength of the resistance Reno met exceeded initial expectations, forcing his battalion into a defensive position. Reno's situation deteriorated rapidly, leaving him vulnerable and isolated from the other battalions. Custer, meanwhile, continued his advance, intent on reaching the settlement's northern perimeter. His understanding of the battlefield was limited to reports from his scouts, which conveyed an incomplete picture of the enemy's true capabilities. Nevertheless, Custer's confidence in his tactical approach remained firm. He believed that his flanking maneuver, combined with Reno's frontal assault, would create the conditions needed to overcome the opposition. As each battalion moved along its designated path, the challenges of synchronizing their actions became increasingly pronounced. Reno's position, initially intended to engage the enemy and draw attention, had become untenable, and the resistance he faced forced a withdrawal. Unaware of Reno's struggle, Custer continued to advance, relying on his perception of the enemy's strength as a foundation for his tactical decisions. The conditions of the battlefield, compounded by the growing distance between Custer's units, underscored the risks of his divided strategy. The difficult terrain limited visibility, further complicating communication and coordination. Custer's decision to split his forces, while based on sound strategic reasoning, was not sufficient to account for the scale of the resistance they encountered. Custer's battalion pressed onward, undeterred by the increasingly complex circumstances. His prior successes had been achieved through similar tactics, and he believed this battle would follow the same pattern. Yet the sheer number of warriors in the settlement signaled a different challenge altogether. Despite the high stakes, Custer's conviction in his own approach persisted, driving him forward into increasingly uncertain conditions. The situation became more precarious as each battalion continued its advance. Reno's brigade, facing mounting opposition, found it increasingly difficult to maintain momentum. The strategy Custer envisioned was unraveling under the strain of unanticipated resistance, and the separation between the units rendered them vulnerable to individual isolation. In this environment, the cohesion of Custer's strategy began to erode. Benteen's reconnaissance efforts, though essential to the overall plan, offered limited support to the battalions actively engaged with the enemy. Each battalion, now fully independent in its actions, was left to contend with the escalating chaos on the battlefield. For Custer, the uncertainty of the situation was tempered by his commitment to his tactical vision. He pressed forward, determined to maintain the integrity of his flanking maneuver, even as the obstacles mounted. The rocky, uneven ground forced Custer's column to adapt to the challenging terrain, slowing their advance and introducing new risks. As the minutes wore on, the reality of the disjointed efforts among the battalions became apparent. The rugged landscape, combined with the growing resistance from the enemy, underscored the limitations of Custer's divided approach. Despite his experience and confidence, the conditions of the battlefield undermined the tactical advantages he had hoped to secure. The complexity of the situation left Custer with limited options. His battalions were now stretched across a wide expanse of land, each operating independently and without clear communication. The ability to regroup or adjust their tactics was compromised by the geographical and logistical challenges inherent to the battlefield. The consequences of Custer's decisions began to crystallize as the enemy forces marshaled their strength in response. The scale of the resistance Reno encountered foreshadowed the difficulties that lay ahead for the rest of the battalions. In the face of such overwhelming odds, the coherence of Custer's strategy was strained beyond its limits. The battle at Little Bighorn, marked by its unique dynamics and unforgiving landscape, was a test of Custer's tactical ingenuity. However, the limitations of his plan were exposed by the realities of the battlefield. Each battalion, isolated from the others, was left to navigate the complexities of the conflict, without the support they had initially anticipated. In the end, the separation between Custer's units left them vulnerable to the unpredictable forces they encountered. The ambition that had driven Custer's decisions was matched by the resilience of the warriors defending their homeland. As Custer's final hour unfolded, the implications of his tactical choices became tragically clear, illustrating the fine line between boldness and overreach on the field of battle. As George Armstrong Custer prepared for his final approach on the village of Little Bighorn, he remained confident in his plan. For Custer, the potential rewards outweighed the risks. His past campaigns had relied on similar tactics, where he divided his forces and executed maneuvers that took the enemy by surprise. Yet this time, the situation was different, a fact that became glaringly apparent as the events unfolded. By 1:26 p.m., Custer had committed his battalion to the high ground. From this elevated position, his soldiers could observe the sprawling encampment below, a settlement of horses and teepees that stretched further than they had expected. It was a scene that underscored the scale of the challenge before them, revealing the enormity of the Native American village and the formidable numbers defending it. The sheer size of the encampment, with its countless horses and rows of teepees, dwarfed previous encounters, presenting a reality that even Custer had not anticipated. This revelation underscored the magnitude of what he was up against, yet it only seemed to strengthen his resolve. In the face of this daunting sight, Custer's confidence did not waver. His strategy was centered on a hammer and anvil approach, wherein he believed that Reno's frontal assault would engage the warriors directly, distracting them while Custer's flanking battalion attacked from the rear. This strategy, Custer believed, would create confusion and disruption within the village, leading to a swift victory. His assumption was that the element of surprise, combined with a forceful assault from multiple directions, would catch the village unprepared and unable to mount a coordinated defense. However, Custer was unaware of a critical detail. Rather than being caught off guard, the Native American forces were actively preparing for a counterattack. Among those who first noticed this were Custer's scouts, including his interpreter, Gerard, who had been stationed atop a nearby knoll. From his vantage point, Gerard observed the warriors herding their ponies downstream, a movement that suggested organization rather than panic. For Gerard, the message was clear. The native forces were mobilizing with purpose. He issued a warning, shouting, "There go your Indians running like devils." This was no chaotic retreat. Instead, it was a calculated, deliberate movement, a sign that the warriors were gathering to defend their village with focused intent. Despite Gerard's urgent warning, Custer was unfazed. His response was immediate and unwavering. Throughout his career, Custer had thrived on decisive, often audacious actions, and this situation was no exception. Rather than reconsider his approach, he viewed the development as confirmation of his plan's viability. Confident that his flanking maneuver would still succeed, Custer chose to press forward along the high ground, aiming to cut off any escape routes. His decision to advance was consistent with his aggressive style, but in this case, it meant proceeding despite clear signs of impending danger. The flanking maneuver was intended to maximize the element of surprise, relying on Reno's frontal assault to keep the native forces occupied. Custer believed this pincer movement would force the settlement into disarray. The tactic had proven effective in previous battles, leading Custer to trust in its efficacy here as well. However, Custer's assessment was based on an incomplete understanding of his opponent's strength. In the escalating conflict, Custer remained unaware of the full scale and readiness of the warriors arrayed against him. The terrain itself soon presented a formidable obstacle, complicating the battalion's movement along the ridge. As they advanced, the steep bluffs and rugged rock formations slowed their pace, forcing the formation to spread out. The battalion, once unified in purpose, began to fragment as the rocky path demanded single-file movement. The uneven ground posed a challenge not only to the soldiers, but also to the horses, whose stability became a pressing concern. This gradual dispersion of Custer's forces increased their vulnerability, making communication between the lead and rear of the column increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Reno's battalion was advancing toward the village, but the complex terrain made it impossible for Custer to maintain a direct line of sight. From his vantage point, Custer could only catch occasional glimpses of Reno's forces as they moved through the bluffs. Without a clear view of Reno's progress, Custer was left to rely on assumptions. He believed Reno's attack was proceeding as planned, unaware of the intense opposition Reno's men were encountering. This breakdown in visual communication marked a critical point in Custer's strategy, as it prevented him from adapting to the rapidly changing conditions on the ground. Reno's initial assault met with fierce resistance, far stronger than anticipated. Facing overwhelming numbers, Reno's unit was soon forced into a retreat, unable to maintain its position against the well-prepared native warriors. However, Custer remained oblivious to Reno's predicament, continuing his advance under the impression that Reno was successfully engaging the village from the south. This disconnect between Custer and Reno highlighted a growing flaw in the plan, as the lack of coordination began to erode the cohesion of their efforts. Instead of retreating, the native forces were now mobilizing for a full-scale counterattack. Led by experienced leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall, the warriors began organizing their ranks to intercept Custer's flanking force. Unbeknownst to Custer, he was advancing directly into a trap. As his battalion moved further into the high ground, they encountered a series of coulees, deep ravines that crisscrossed the landscape. These natural barriers slowed their progress, forcing the battalion to travel in single file, further stretching out the formation and exposing the soldiers to additional risks. The coulees, which Custer initially saw as protective channels, soon became a hindrance. The narrow passages confined his troops, making them vulnerable to attacks from above. It was within these coulees that Custer's troops began to sense the presence of nearby warriors. Scouts reported sightings of small groups of native fighters shadowing their movements along the ridges. Yet, despite these warnings, Custer pressed onward, determined to complete his flanking maneuver and reach the far side of the settlement. The decision to advance, even in the face of escalating danger, reflected Custer's confidence in his tactical superiority. His past successes had reinforced a belief in his ability to outmaneuver opponents, a belief that now drove him to persist. As the battalion descended deeper into the coulees, Custer's focus remained fixed on reaching the village's northern perimeter. The possibility of retreat or a tactical repositioning was not entertained. In Custer's mind, his approach was sound, and the risks were justified. He had committed to his strategy, viewing any deviation as a sign of weakness. Yet, the mounting evidence of danger did little to sway his conviction. The challenges of the terrain, combined with the enemy's growing presence, underscored the precariousness of Custer's position, but his confidence remained unshaken. The narrow coulees limited Custer's ability to maintain an organized formation, causing his troops to fan out in a disjointed line. Communication within the column became increasingly difficult, further complicating efforts to coordinate their movements. The rough, uneven ground slowed the horses, intensifying the strain on both men and animals. Despite the mounting difficulties, Custer's resolve was undiminished. He continued to push northward, convinced that his strategy would ultimately prevail. The deepening isolation of Custer's battalion became evident as they ventured further into the high country. The geographic and logistical challenges of the landscape were compounded by the unseen forces gathering in response. Warriors under the leadership of Crazy Horse and Gaul had anticipated Custer's approach and were now positioning themselves along the ridges, ready to confront the flanking column. The extent of the threat remained unknown to Custer, whose focus on his objectives prevented him from fully assessing the situation. The rugged landscape of the coulees and bluffs had transformed from a potential tactical asset into a liability. Originally seen as cover, these features now hindered Custer's ability to maneuver and respond. The physical separation within the battalion created vulnerabilities that the native forces would soon exploit. Scouts continued to report sightings of warriors, yet Custer maintained his course, prioritizing his objective over the growing risks. His conviction in his tactical approach was unwavering, yet this confidence increasingly bordered on fatal overreach. As the battalion proceeded, the dispersed formation made them susceptible to attacks from the elevated positions held by the native forces. The natural geography of the coulees served as funnels, channeling the soldiers into confined spaces where their movement was restricted. In these conditions, Custer's men found themselves exposed, their options for defense limited by the narrow confines of the terrain. It was within these constraints that the full extent of Custer's vulnerability became apparent, as the enemy capitalized on the battalion's fragmented positioning. Custer's reliance on his past successes, combined with an unshakable belief in his tactical acumen, had led him to underestimate the complexities of the battlefield. His confidence in his flanking maneuver had blinded him to the limitations imposed by the rugged terrain and the scale of the opposition. This overconfidence, fueled by previous victories, now placed his battalion at a severe disadvantage. As Custer pressed forward, his ability to adapt was hindered by his commitment to his initial plan. The situation reached a critical point as Custer's troops encountered the coulees' final passages. The bottleneck created by these natural barriers forced the column into an even tighter formation, reducing their ability to respond to emerging threats. From their positions along the ridges, the native forces observed the battalion's movements, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The terrain, which Custer had initially viewed as a strategic advantage, had become a liability, constraining his options and limiting his battalion's effectiveness. At this juncture, Custer's determination to press onward reflected not only his belief in his tactical superiority, but also a refusal to acknowledge the risks that had accumulated. His past achievements had instilled in him a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and this unwavering resolve now left him vulnerable to the very forces he sought to outflank. The warnings from his scouts, the difficulties imposed by the terrain, and the indications of a mounting enemy presence were all outweighed by Custer's focus on executing his plan. The battle had reached a turning point. Custer's decision to persist, even as the tactical landscape shifted against him, illustrated a mindset driven by a conviction in his own judgment. The challenges posed by the coulees and the native forces lying in wait underscored the precariousness of his position. Custer's reliance on past strategies, combined with his commitment to a rigid course of action, had led him into a situation where adaptability was crucial, yet elusive. In this moment, Custer's belief in his own capabilities remained steadfast. His approach to leadership, characterized by decisive action and confidence in his strategies, had served him well in the past. However, at Little Bighorn, these qualities became liabilities as the battle unfolded in ways that Custer had not anticipated. The escalating danger, compounded by the limitations of the terrain and the organized resistance from native forces, highlighted the risks inherent in Custer's plan. As Custer's battalion pushed deeper into the coulees, the full scope of their vulnerability became apparent. The terrain that once offered cover now served as a death trap, channeling the soldiers into positions where they could be easily targeted. The persistence that had defined Custer's approach was now a double-edged sword, as his commitment to his strategy left little room for adjustment. In this landscape of rising danger, Custer's confidence ultimately became his undoing, setting the stage for the tragic outcome that would define his legacy. At precisely 1:42 p.m., George Armstrong Custer gazed out from his vantage point high above the valley. From this elevated position, he could survey the unfolding events, but what he saw below was cause for concern. Smoke rose from the settlement, indicating active resistance from the native forces, and his forces were scattered in an uncoordinated array. The formations of warriors assembling at a distance signaled a challenge far greater than expected. Despite these ominous signs, Custer remained resolute in his decision to move forward, interpreting the signs as confirmation of his plan rather than as warning signals. In his view, the disorganization of the village and the gathering of warriors could be signs that his flanking maneuver was forcing the intended chaos. Communication with his scouts, including Mitch Boyer and Gerard, was intermittent and fragmented. The updates they provided were often incomplete, failing to offer the full perspective that Custer needed to reassess his position. Boyer and Gerard's observations, while valuable, were piecemeal and occasionally conflicting. Yet, Custer remained convinced that his current position offered a strategic advantage. Instead of seeing these signs as indicators of a potential shift in the battle's momentum, he chose to see them as validation of his flanking strategy. The warriors' concentration on Reno's assault seemed to confirm that their attention was divided, creating an opening Custer believed he could exploit. One of Custer's Crow scouts, Curley, later recounted his last moments with the battalion as they moved into more challenging terrain. The formation, initially tight, began to stretch out and thin as they advanced through the coulees. This thinning, a result of the uneven terrain, became a significant vulnerability. From his position, Curley could see what Custer could not. Native warriors were actively moving to block their route. Led by experienced figures like Gall and Crazy Horse, the native forces anticipated Custer's strategy and took steps to counter it. They were positioning themselves strategically to intercept and overwhelm Custer's advancing column. As Custer's battalion entered the Medicine Tail Coulee, a small gully near the settlement, the fate of his men was effectively sealed. The coulee's rugged landscape, which had initially offered potential cover, soon became a liability, limiting movement and visibility. Despite reports of warriors gathering on the ridges above, Custer failed to perceive the full extent of the threat facing his battalion. Isolated from the rest of his forces and fatigued from the arduous march, his battalion was caught off guard and unprepared for the ferocity of the impending attack. At this moment, the collective force of the native counterattack became evident. Although Iron Cedar, a lesser-known warrior, is often overlooked in mainstream accounts of the battle, his actions were crucial in signaling the start of the counteroffensive. Positioned on a ridge, Iron Cedar observed Custer's approach and quickly returned to alert the rest of the village. Within minutes, the entire community mobilized. Previously focused on defending against Reno's assault, Gall and other leaders now redirected their efforts toward countering Custer's flanking maneuver. This swift reallocation of resources and personnel highlighted the native forces' adaptability and readiness. By the time Custer's battalion reached the base of Medicine Tail Coulee around 2:05 p.m., they were exhausted from the demanding terrain and took a brief moment to regroup. However, this pause offered little relief. Before the men could fully organize their defenses, the first shots of the counterattack echoed across the coulee. The warriors, having anticipated Custer's movements, launched an overwhelming offensive. The initial volley of gunfire quickly escalated, and within moments, the battleground descended into chaos. Custer's previous successes had conditioned him to expect that aggression and surprise would be sufficient to overwhelm his opponents. Yet, in this case, he faced an enemy that was neither unprepared nor easily intimidated. The native warriors had accurately predicted his approach, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain and their tactical positioning to trap his forces. The result was a swift and devastating assault that quickly destabilized Custer's formation. The coulee, originally intended as a shield, became a corridor of vulnerability. Its narrow passages and steep ridges restricted Custer's options, limiting his ability to maneuver or form an effective line of defense. The battalion's separation from Reno's forces only heightened the challenges, as any hope of reinforcement or coordination was now impossible. Cut off from the other battalions, Custer's men found themselves isolated, facing a numerically superior force in a confined space with little room to retreat. The native forces, fully aware of their advantage, pressed the attack with unrelenting force. The combination of tactical foresight and intimate knowledge of the landscape allowed the warriors to exploit every weakness in Custer's position. Within minutes, the carefully laid plans that had guided Custer's advance were rendered irrelevant by the reality of the counterattack. His men, unprepared for the scale and intensity of the assault, struggled to maintain cohesion as the warriors closed in from multiple directions. Curley's account of the battle provides valuable insight into the final moments of Custer's battalion. As the formation fragmented under pressure, the soldiers' attempts to regroup were met with a relentless barrage of attacks from the ridges above. The warriors' use of elevated positions allowed them to rain gunfire and arrows down on Custer's men, further constraining their ability to respond effectively. The coulee, which had initially provided some degree of cover, now served as a funnel, channeling the battalion into a confined space where escape was virtually impossible. The speed and coordination of the native counterattack underscored their strategic acumen. Gall and Crazy Horse had anticipated Custer's flanking maneuver, positioning their forces in such a way that escape routes were effectively cut off. The rapid response of the warriors demonstrated their readiness and resilience, qualities that Custer had underestimated. His assumption that a swift, aggressive assault would catch the village unprepared was proven disastrously wrong. Instead of a scattered and retreating enemy, he encountered a unified and determined force, one that was fully prepared to defend its territory. The chaos within the coulee continued to intensify as the warriors closed in, capitalizing on the disarray that had overtaken Custer's battalion. The confined space exacerbated the challenges of communication and coordination among the soldiers. As the lines broke down, individual groups of soldiers found themselves isolated and surrounded, with little chance of regrouping. The warriors, operating with a high degree of coordination, targeted these pockets of resistance, further weakening Custer's already vulnerable position. By the time the full extent of the counterattack became apparent, it was too late for Custer to alter his strategy. The relentless assault had disrupted his formation beyond repair, leaving his men scattered and disorganized. Attempts to regroup or establish a defensive line were thwarted by the overwhelming numbers and tactical positioning of the native forces. The battalion's isolation from the rest of Custer's forces compounded the problem, as any potential reinforcements were either engaged elsewhere or too far removed to provide assistance. The warriors' use of elevated positions gave them a significant advantage, allowing them to strike with precision while minimizing their own exposure. From these vantage points, they could observe and anticipate the movements of Custer's men, adjusting their tactics in real time. The result was a coordinated and adaptive assault that outpaced any response Custer's battalion could muster. The soldiers, unaccustomed to such terrain, and the tactics employed by the native forces, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. As the battle wore on, the physical and psychological strain on Custer's men became increasingly evident. The soldiers, already exhausted from the march and disoriented by the relentless assault, faced an enemy that appeared to be everywhere at once. The warriors' knowledge of the terrain allowed them to move fluidly between the ridges, striking from unexpected angles and keeping Custer's men off balance. The coulie's confined spaces limited visibility, creating an atmosphere of confusion and disarray that further eroded the soldiers' ability to respond effectively. Iron Cedar's role in the counteroffensive, though often underemphasized in mainstream accounts, highlights the importance of individual actions within the larger strategy. His quick response to Custer's approach and his subsequent rallying of the village underscored the warriors' readiness and commitment to defending their home. The rapid mobilization of the native forces, facilitated by figures like Iron Cedar, allowed them to mount an immediate and overwhelming response. This swift reaction not only halted Custer's advance, but also set the stage for the battle's decisive moments. As Custer's battalion continued to disintegrate under the pressure of the assault, the lack of options became starkly apparent. Trapped within the coulee and cut off from potential reinforcements, the soldiers faced a bleak reality. The defensive capabilities that Custer had counted on were rendered ineffective by the terrain and the sheer force of the native counterattack. The coolie's natural constraints, combined with the warriors' strategic positioning, left Custer's men with few avenues for escape or regrouping. The intensity of the counterattack reached its peak as the warriors closed in, pressing their advantage with unrelenting force. The combination of tactical foresight, superior knowledge of the landscape, and coordinated action allowed the native forces to dismantle Custer's battalion piece by piece. In the end, the carefully crafted strategy that had driven Custer's advance was rendered irrelevant by the reality of the battlefield. His men, isolated and overwhelmed, were left with no option but to confront the full weight of the counteroffensive. As the battle drew to a close, the outcome was unmistakable. Custer's reliance on aggressive tactics and his underestimation of the native forces had led him into a situation from which there was no escape. The coulee, which he had viewed as a potential tactical advantage, became a trap that sealed the fate of his battalion. The native forces, through a combination of strategy and resilience, had successfully defended their territory, marking the end of Custer's final campaign. In retrospect, the events at Medicine Tail Coulee underscore the critical miscalculations that defined Custer's approach. His decision to press forward despite mounting evidence of danger reflected a confidence that ultimately proved costly. The native forces' swift and decisive response highlighted the effectiveness of their strategy, underscoring the limitations of Custer's assumptions. In the final moments of the battle, the consequences of these miscalculations became tragically clear, sealing the fate of Custer and his battalion within the confines of the coulee. This conclusive phase of the battle serves as a testament to the resilience and tactical proficiency of the native forces. Their ability to anticipate and counter Custer's movements demonstrated a level of coordination and adaptability that Custer had not foreseen. In the end, the battle at Medicine Tail Coulee stands as a stark reminder of the perils of underestimating an opponent and the importance of situational awareness on the battlefield. In this analysis of George Armstrong Custer's last hours at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the prevailing narrative often portrays his actions as reckless, a headlong charge into disaster. However, a more nuanced examination reveals a leader who was not simply rushing forward without thought, but rather responding to the sparse information available to him in real time. Given the fragmented reports from his scouts and the mounting pressure of the battlefield, Custer made modifications to his strategy as best he could, though his options were few. Facing a force far larger than he anticipated, compounded by the challenging landscape and the growing disorganization among his troops, Custer found himself in an increasingly untenable position. Ultimately, Custer's confidence in his own tactical skills and his misjudgment of the Native American force's strength contributed to his downfall. Yet, the critical factors that sealed his fate were his unit's breakdown in communication and the overwhelming power of the resistance they faced. By the time Custer's battalion entered Medicine Tail Coulee, it was already too late to change course. The very land he had relied upon as an advantage now became an adversary, as unforgiving as the forces of the Cheyenne and Sioux warriors gathering above. Once in Medicine Tail Coulee, Custer's men quickly found their ability to maneuver hampered by the tight confines of the terrain. The narrow pathways, which they had initially hoped would provide cover, now restricted their formation, turning what had been an orderly column into a scattered line of soldiers. The combination of the rocky landscape and the rising exhaustion of the troops created a situation where maintaining cohesion was nearly impossible. The harsh sunlight beat down, casting long shadows across the coulee and intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. However, Custer still viewed this descent as his last tactical opportunity. He believed that crossing the Little Bighorn River and reaching the rear of the settlement might allow him to execute a decisive blow. At around 2:05 p.m., Custer's battalion finally arrived at the coolie's base, and from this position, he could see the river glinting in the midday sun. Crossing it would be crucial to his plan, which was to complete a flanking maneuver and trap the native forces between his own troops and Reno's. This tactic relied on the assumption that Reno was still engaging the front of the village. What Custer did not know was that Reno's assault had already collapsed, and his forces had been driven back by an overwhelming counterattack. The strength of the Native American counteroffensive, led by Crazy Horse and Gall, had forced Reno's men into a hasty retreat. After ordering his troops to dismount and form a skirmish line around 1:45 p.m., Reno faced a fierce attack from warriors who vastly outnumbered his regiment. Outmaneuvered and under heavy assault, Reno's forces were forced to withdraw to the timber along the riverbank, where they attempted a last stand. This disorderly retreat, however, was hidden from Custer's view on the bluffs. He continued with his maneuver under the impression that Reno was successfully engaging the village from the front, unaware of the disaster unfolding below. Eyewitness reports from scouts like Curley and Mitch Boyer provide crucial insight into this stage of the battle. As Custer's column dipped into Medicine Tail Coulee, Curley observed the formation thinning out, a consequence of both the punishing terrain and the oppressive heat. Boyer, meanwhile, noted a growing unease among the soldiers. Although they had anticipated encountering native warriors, the signs before them suggested something far more foreboding: a well-prepared defense. From their elevated positions, the native forces could see Custer's battalion laid bare, vulnerable in the narrow coulee, though Custer himself was largely blind to this looming threat. Iron Cedar, a scout from the native side, had already detected Custer's approach and informed Gall and Crazy Horse of the flanking column's movements. By the time Custer's forces reached the coulee's base, the warriors were stationed on the ridges above, primed to strike. This strategic positioning gave them a decisive advantage, allowing them to control the high ground as they prepared to confront Custer's soldiers below. Despite the importance of this stage of the battle, many accounts often overlook the significance of Custer's descent into Medicine Tail Coulee. This event, however, illustrates how terrain can determine the outcome of a conflict, as much as the size and strength of the forces involved. In entering the coulee, Custer's options had become drastically limited. The passageways, which initially offered some degree of tactical cover, now became choke points that hindered movement and communication. The growing numbers of warriors on the ridges added to the peril, as Custer's forces were funneled into increasingly narrow paths that restricted their mobility. As the column wound deeper into the coulee, the once cohesive formation further unraveled, leaving the soldiers scattered and exposed. In the moments leading up to the assault, Custer remained focused on his goal of completing the flanking maneuver. The coulee, once a potential path to success, had now transformed into what many have referred to as a death file. The geography of the land served to isolate Custer's battalion, as the narrow passageways and steep walls constrained their ability to respond effectively to any sudden threat. As warriors began to gather in greater numbers along the ridges, the likelihood of survival diminished for Custer and his men. The descent had left Custer with few choices, and the warriors wasted no time in exploiting his vulnerable position. The elevated positions of Gall, Crazy Horse, and their warriors allowed them to unleash a barrage of fire from above, striking down upon the disorganized battalion. Despite the urgency of the situation, the restrictive terrain prevented Custer's forces from regrouping or mounting a coordinated defense. The soldiers' previous training and discipline were of little use in the face of the overwhelming assault from the high ground. The intensity of the attack was amplified by the narrow confines of the coulee. Warriors positioned on the ridges controlled the battlefield, able to rain fire and arrows down upon Custer's men with relative safety. The soldiers, confined to the coulee's base, were left with limited visibility and even fewer options for escape. The once orderly advance had devolved into chaos as each unit struggled to find cover from the relentless assault coming from above. Despite the worsening conditions, Custer held fast to his objective. His intention had been to push through the coulee and reach the Little Bighorn River, executing a surprise attack from the rear of the settlement. Yet the strategic advantage he had envisioned was now a distant possibility. rendered impossible by the fierce resistance and the confining landscape. The belief that he could outmaneuver the native forces was proving to be a costly miscalculation, one that left his battalion isolated and surrounded. The coulee, which initially offered some hope of concealment, had transformed into a fatal trap. Warriors descended from the ridges, closing in on the scattered soldiers below. The confined space of the coulee magnified the impact of each attack, as Custer's men found themselves unable to establish any form of defensive line. The narrowness of the terrain made it nearly impossible for them to move as a unified force, reducing the battalion to a series of isolated groups struggling to hold their ground. The pressure mounted as more warriors entered the fray, capitalizing on Custer's compromised position. The steep walls of the coulee and the relentless advance of the warriors left Custer with few options beyond a desperate attempt to push forward. The scattered formation of his troops, combined with the ever-present threat from above, led to mounting casualties. For Custer, the path forward had become a gauntlet of narrow, exposed passages, with each step bringing his battalion closer to annihilation. As the battle progressed, the psychological toll on Custer's men became increasingly evident. Facing an unrelenting assault from a determined and strategically positioned enemy, the soldiers' attempts to regroup were quickly stymied. The geography of the coulee offered little respite, with its steep walls and limited cover exacerbating the sense of entrapment. The realization that they were cut off from reinforcement or retreat weighed heavily on the men, heightening the desperation of their situation. Iron Cedar's actions earlier in the battle had set the stage for the native forces' victory. His quick observation of Custer's movements and subsequent report allowed Gall and Crazy Horse to marshal their forces effectively, positioning them in anticipation of Custer's approach. This tactical foresight enabled the native forces to counter Custer's plan before it could come to fruition, converting his flanking maneuver into a disadvantage. By the time Custer realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late to alter his strategy or escape the trap that had been laid. As Custer's men continued to struggle within the coulee, the scale of their predicament became increasingly clear. The battalion's isolation from the rest of Custer's forces eliminated any possibility of external support, leaving them to face the brunt of the counterattack alone. Warriors on the ridges maintained a steady barrage, preventing the soldiers from mounting any effective response. Each attempt to regroup or find cover was met with fierce opposition as the warriors closed in, exploiting every weakness in Custer's position. The final moments of the battle were marked by a grim realization. Custer's tactical gamble had failed. His reliance on rapid movement and the element of surprise had backfired, placing his battalion at the mercy of an enemy that was both prepared and strategically positioned. The very terrain that Custer had viewed as a potential advantage had become a trap, sealing the fate of his men within the confines of Medicine Tail Coulee. As the native forces pressed their advantage, the scope of Custer's miscalculation became painfully evident. His initial plan to outflank and overpower the village had relied on assumptions that no longer held true. The warriors' readiness and control of the high ground negated any element of surprise, rendering his strategy ineffective. The landscape, with its unforgiving geography, had imposed constraints that Custer could not overcome. The coulee's narrow paths and steep ridges effectively isolated Custer's forces, preventing them from mounting a cohesive defense. Each attempt to resist was met with overwhelming force from above, as the warriors used their elevated positions to devastating effect. For Custer's men, the battle had become a fight for survival, with little hope of reinforcement or escape. The once organized battalion had been reduced to a series of disjointed skirmishes, each group fending off attacks from all sides. In the end, the combination of strategic foresight, superior positioning, and control of the high ground allowed the native forces to dismantle Custer's battalion piece by piece. The coulee, which Custer had viewed as a pathway to victory, had instead become the site of his final stand. The isolation of his forces, coupled with the relentless assault from the warriors above, left him with no options. The meticulously planned flanking maneuver that had seemed so promising ultimately became a fatal misjudgment. The conclusion of the battle underscored the resilience and tactical skill of the native forces, who had successfully defended their territory against a formidable opponent. Custer's approach, marked by confidence in his strategy and reliance on speed and surprise, had proven inadequate in the face of a well-prepared enemy. The narrow confines of Medicine Tail Coulee had amplified every misstep, transforming the battlefield into a confined space where his men could not adapt or survive. The events within Medicine Tail Coulee stand as a testament to the decisive role of terrain and strategy in warfare. Custer's final hours, marked by a series of misjudgments and an inability to adjust to the changing dynamics of the battle, illustrate the inherent risks of overconfidence in the face of an unknown adversary. In the end, the warrior's tactical acumen and control of the battlefield sealed Custer's fate, leaving Medicine Tail Coulee as the final chapter in his storied, yet ultimately tragic, military career.